Hello, bruvs. Whoa, shaky, bruv. I'm becoming a bit obsessed with this book, bruv, that I bought yesterday. It was 2 days ago now, since it's Wednesday. The Unnatural History of the Nanny by Jonathan Gathorne-Hardy. The inner flap of the jacket says, "Perhaps the most remarkable and envied of all British institutions is the British nanny. Yet, curiously, she has never received the historical and literary treatment which the nannied classes all over the world would certainly regard as her due. This long-felt gap is now most ably filled in Jonathan Gathorne-Hardy's unique, delightful, fascinating book. And the result is not only a history of the nanny from the early 19th century to the woman who played such a large part in molding the character of Winston Churchill, but in effect a psychological history of England and an important addition to the subject of child-rearing. Mr. Gathorne-Hardy, or is it Gathorne, Hardy has researched both the memoirs of the great for nanny recollections and a vast array of fiction, much of it dealing with the cruelty and perversion sometimes associated with nannies. I didn't know there was cruelty and perversion, bruv. He had conducted dozens of interviews and evoked dozens of responses, some bitter, some alarming, many extremely affectionate, for although the nanny may now have all but disappeared from English life, her influence is still very much felt. The values she taught still very much alive. She may vanish, but she cannot be replaced. And the Unnatural History of the Nanny is an important and brilliant account of who and what she is." I read both professional and a few brief professional and amateur reviews, and one suggested that once the book came out that hundreds of people wrote this author and told them about their experiences. Surprised there wasn't a second book, but this was from 1972, and maybe there was a follow-up. I haven't really looked it up, bruv. I guess it's 73, 72. And then the professional, maybe the amateur, it was an amateur review, stated that, there it is, "During the course of my researches, I received some 250 letters, a number of which resulted in a good deal of correspondence." Maybe it wasn't after publication, it was the announcement of the forthcoming book. "These letters were invaluable, particularly those of Lady Anne Hill, Mrs. France Partridge, blah, blah, blah." Anyways, the other review, which was on Amazon, said that the book was an interesting book, but that it was dated. But I'm going to read some pages from this just to see what we got going there. "Nanny. I sing along, neglected dame. Let's play and poets all proclaim the wonder of the mother's name, and even that of granny. Let others tell with loud hurrahs the general praises of papas. I hymn the mother of mammas. I sing the British nanny. Not every pink and girlish thing that pushes around the pram. The ancient rock-like nurse I sing, Britannia's virgin dam. That, old as mountains and as stout, from child to child is passed about, till childless yet she passes out, the lonely British nanny." Well, you can see they didn't have much thought of her. I did, because I put a Mylar jacket on it. I like this book. It's interesting. Interesting topic that you never think of, bruv. Chapter 1, The Nanny Phenomenon and the Case of Winston Churchill. Some years ago I read 2 books by chance, one after the other, in each of which a nanny briefly figured. The first was a biography of Lord George Curzon by Kenneth Rose. In this he quotes some notes about the nanny, Miss Paraman. The very name is like some flagellant's fantasy, which Curzon made years later. In her savage moments she was a brutal and vindictive tyrant, and I have often thought since that she must have been insane. She persecuted and beat us in the most cruel way and established over us a system of terrorism so complete that not one of us ever mustered up the courage to walk upstairs and tell our father or our mother. She spanked us with the sole of her slipper on the bare back, beat us with her brushes, tied us for long hours to chairs in uncomfortable positions, with our hands holding a pole or a blackboard behind our backs, shut us up in darkness, practiced on us every kind of petty persecution, wounded our pride by dressing us, one in particular, in red shining calico petticoats I was obliged to make my own, with an immense conical cap on our heads, round which, as well as on our breasts and backs, were sewn strips of paper, bearing in enormous characters written by ourselves the words liar, sneak, coward, lubber, and the like. In this guise she compelled us to go out in the pleasure ground and show ourselves to the gardeners. She forced us to walk through the park at even distances, never communicating with each other, to the village and show ourselves to the villagers. It never occurred to us that these good folk sympathized intensely with us and regarded her as a fiend. Our pride was much too deeply hurt, bruv. She made us trundle our hoops as young children, all alone, up and down a place in the grounds near the hermitage where were tall black fir trees and a general air of gloom and of which we were intensely afraid. She forced us to confess to lies which we had never told, to sins which we had never committed, and then punished us savagely as being self condemned. For weeks we were not allowed to speak to each other or to a human soul. Immediately after this I read Churchill, Four Faces and the Man, a collection of essays about Churchill. At one point he quotes part of a passage which I give here in full from Churchill's only novel, Savola. Savola? Let me put something on here, bruv. Savrola. Let's get back. Savrola's thoughts were interrupted by the entrance of the old woman with the tray. He was tired, but the decencies of life had to be. He rose and passed into the inner room to change his clothes and make his toilet. When he returned, the table was laid. The soup he had asked for had been expanded by the care of his housekeeper into a more elaborate meal. She waited on him, plying him the while with questions and watching his appetite with anxious pleasure. She had nursed him from his birth up with a devotion and care which knew no break. It is a strange thing, the love of these women. Perhaps it is the only disinterested affection in the world. The mother loves her child. That is material nature. The youth loves his sweetheart. That too may be explained. The dog loves his master. He feeds him. A man loves his friend. He has stood by him perhaps at doubtful moments. And all these are reasons. In all there are reasons, but the love of a foster mother for her charge appears absolutely irrational. It is one of the few proofs not to be explained, even by the association of ideas, that the nature of mankind is superior to mere utilitarianizing, and that his destinies are high. It was not the passage itself which struck me particularly. It is quite a celebrated one, and I vaguely remembered reading it before. Nor was it the contrast between Churchill's feelings towards his nurse and the understandable bitterness which Curzon felt towards the monster who had ruled him. But it was the use that Dr. Storm made of it. His comment on it was that what was surprising was Churchill's surprise that a nurse should love her charges. It is almost as though he expected a nurse to dislike them. Yet, Dr. Storr argued, nannies and nurses have no children or husbands. It is natural they should love the children put under them. Now, leaving aside for the moment that Churchill is not saying this love is unnatural, but that it is not based on any obvious rational self-interested motive, and that he, as Savrola, is expressing not so much surprise as gratitude. What further struck me as strange was that Dr. Storr never once referred to Churchill's nurse again. Yet I seemed to remember from somewhere, probably where I had originally read the passage Storr quoted, that Churchill's nurse had played an important, even crucial role in his life. Certainly, Mrs. Parriman had dictated the general shape of Curzon's future career, her savagery both whipping him on and, it could be argued, creating those difficulties of temperament which finally prevented him becoming Prime Minister. If the same dominance could be attributed to the person who looked after Churchill, then these were two extremely important and influential women, Curzon among a great many other million people, for 7 years, and Foreign Secretary in the governments of Lloyd George, Bonar Law, and Baldwin. Churchill's position needs no explanation. It had next occurred to me in the process which led to this book that an entirely new view, and a very much more accurate one, might be obtained of a large number of our past rulers if they were studied with reference to their nannies. Indeed, it might well lead one to a new interpretation of British history. The nanny view of history, because as well as Curzon, and if I was right, Churchill, probably the vast majority of those in all spheres, who had governed or influenced our lives during the last 100 or 150 years, Curzon was born in 1850, Churchill in 1874, had been brought up by a nanny, those devoted or docile or savage women. Their temperaments, as various as human nature, might be expected to have played an infinitely greater part in the upbringing and character formation of our great men than had their own parents. And not only great men, thousands, even perhaps millions of lesser men too, for surely it had been an army, a great host of nannies that had swept Britain sometime in the 19th and earlier 20th centuries, engulfing not just the aristocracy and upper ranks of society, but reaching far down into the middle classes as well. It was, when I thought about it, a remarkable phenomenon. How was it that hundreds of thousands of mothers, apparently normal, could simply abandon all loving and disciplining in company of their little children, sometimes almost from birth, to the absolute care of other women, total strangers, nearly always uneducated, about whose character they must usually have had no real idea at all? It was a practice, as far as I knew, unparalleled on such a vast scale in any other culture which had ever existed. How had it arisen? When and under what circumstances? How did it progress? And as it had certainly now done, decline, above all, what effects did it have? So began my long and often perplexing pursuit of that unique, sometimes saint-like, sometimes horrifying, sometimes baffling figure, the British nanny. Scope of the book. Churchill and Curzon aroused my curiosity, but of course number is the point. A cultural pattern of this sort is of no significance unless it is statistically large enough to affect the society in which it operates. 10 nannies may be interesting, and if they are the nannies of prime ministers, will have had influence. 2,000 or 5,000 nannies, as perhaps we have now, makes an interesting study in survival in a specialized area of privilege. But 1 million nannies, 2 million nannies, I shall deal later with the accuracy of nanny figures. And this, continuing for a great number of years, is a situation worth studying to see, however tentatively, if it had any recognizable and large-scale social effects. For this reason, it is important that I did not define precisely the limits of this book, who I will and will not count as a British nanny. Early on, when I was still reading and interviewing, I received an extremely sharp letter from an old ex-nanny called Mrs. Wake. She said that it was impossible for me to have had a nanny myself. Indeed, impossible for me to know or write about nannies, because the real Nanny, the true Victorian Nanny, disappeared in 1914. This old Nanny would have started, she said, as a nursery maid at 12, worked long and arduous hours under a draconian RSM. Nanny painfully worked her way up to undernurse, or even second undernurse, and finally have achieved nannydom herself, with the nursery far removed from the rest of the house, nursery maids under her, and numerous charge. Over these charges she would have wielded despotic power, to use benevolently or not according to her temperament. Nor would the parents have had anything to do with the children until they were at least 7, if then. They might have seen their mother for 10 minutes in the morning, then sometime between 4:30 and 6, they would have spent an hour or so in the drawing room before returning to the nursery. This pattern would have been inflexible. Now, this figure, the classic Nanny, will of course occupy an important position in this book. She marks the point at which our subject reached her apogee, accurately placed by Mrs. Wake between 1895 and 1914. The classic Nanny would probably not incidentally have been called Nanny, at least by the adults. The origins of the word are extremely obscure, but it seems not to have become universal until the 1920s. Before the First World War was used by children and not adults, and in the 19th century she was called nurse or Mrs. Nor did the classic Nanny disappear in 1914. On the contrary, she flourished until 1939, and even now in some distant wealthy spot in a remote county, you can occasionally find single, usually very ancient, but still vigorous specimens, wrinkled relics of the Plasticine age. The classic Nanny is in a sense the center of this book. She is not its whole subject. Because, as I have said, whoa, that's your hand, Bubba. Get it off there. Because, as I have said, the unusual and increased interesting thing about large segments of English society at various times, particularly from somewhere around the mid-19th century on, has been their willingness to allow other people to bring up their children. It is this situation in its entirety that I want to study. I want to include all the women who looked after other people's children. I shall examine all forms of delegation, from the most absolute, when the child was given to foster parents, through the infinitely various and often subtle degrees of control accorded to or shared with the nanny, down to the reverse situation, where the mother is dominant and only helped by a maid. And our study will sometimes include women who appear to have the role of, or even called, governess. This is partly because in the 16th, 17th, and to a degree, still in the 18th centuries, the nurse in larger, grander households was also expected to teach a child to read and write. But at the age of 2 or 3, when her chief role was still nursing, Jack Verney in the 16th century was taught to sing at the age of 3. John Evelyn, the 17th century diarist, wrote that I was not instructed in my rudiments until I was 4. Evidently late. In the 19th century, this practice of nurse-governess continued with the nursery governess. But as it became fashionable to have a governess, the nursery prefix would often get dropped. Where the charges are 6 or under, and where her duties are not so much to instruct as to look after and bring up the children, then she is in effect a nanny, and I have included her. But where the children are older, and where education is the prime object, then she falls outside my scope. Churchill and Nanny Everest. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. House of Commons, June 4th, 1914. This is a famous speech. It has supplanted the words which Shakespeare gave Henry V before Agincourt. Before delving into the historical background of the Nanny, necessary and fascinating as this was, I decided first to satisfy my curiosity about Winston Churchill. Sounds boring, but let's labor on. In his essay on the subject, though he has used several subsidiary factors as buttresses to the line of argument, Anthony Storr bases his main case on parental neglect. This he has no difficulty in establishing. There can be no doubt that Churchill was neglected by both parents. His father, Lord Randolph, was an obsessed politician absorbed in the machinations of politics. His mother was extremely young, extremely beautiful, and completely caught up in the whirl of fashionable society. They entertained and were entertained constantly. Sometimes whole weeks passed when they barely saw Winston at all. Now, the consequences of a deprived and neglected childhood have been well charted. Dr. Storr charts them again and then sees how they fit Churchill. Their aptness is at times quite uncanny. If a child's emotional needs are not fulfilled, or are only partially fulfilled by his parents, he will feel frustrated. Frustration leads to feelings of hostility, but hostility which cannot be expressed against those who have caused it because the child needs the love they are denying him. A number of things, therefore, happen. The first is that he creates in his imagination a picture of the parents he would like to have and have had and pretends he did have that love. Psychiatrists have often observed, writes Dr. Storr, that delinquent and emotionally disturbed children who have parents who are actually neglectful or cruel still maintain that these bad parents are really good and blame themselves for their parents' fault. A small child, being weak and defenseless, finds it unbearable to believe that there are no adults who love, support, and guide him, and if there are not, he invents them. But this idealization is, of course, very much easier if the parents are never there. They can then, in effect, become idols as well. Both processes took place in Churchill. All his life he expressed his admiration and love of his parents, particularly of his mother. She shone for me, he wrote, like the evening star. I loved her dearly, but at a distance. Later, he transferred this conception of romantic perfection onto women in general. Violet Bonham Carter, among others, commented on this. This inner circle of friends contained no women. They had their own place in his life. His approach to women was essentially romantic. He had a lively susceptibility to beauty, glamour, radiance, and those who possessed these qualities were not subjected to analysis. This possession of all the cardinal virtues was assumed as a matter of course. I remember him taking umbrage when I once commented on the innocence of his approach to women. He was affronted by this epithet as applied to himself, yet, to me, he would certainly have applied it as a term of praise. And of course, since women were perfect, a woman queen must be the quintessence of perfection. Once, after staring raptly at a photograph of her for some time, he murmured, "Lovely, inspiring. All the film people in the world, if they had scoured the globe, could not have found anyone so suited to the part." Another aspect of deprived children is that they often continue to make the demands in adult life which were not met when they were young. They are selfish and querulous. They insist on little services, appear incapable of looking after themselves, behave like big, spoilt babies. Churchill certainly had this side to his character, and when he was able to obtain the attentions he wanted, he revelled in them. Whenever he was ill, he tried to get at least 2 nurses to look after him. Lady Churchill once said to Churchill's doctor, Lord Moran, "Winston is a pasha. If he cannot clap clap his hands for a servant. He calls for Walter, and as he enters the house. If it were left to him, he'd have 2 nurses for the rest of his life. He would like 2 in the room, 2 in the passage. He is never so happy, Charles as he is, when one of the nurses is doing something for him while Walter puts on his socks. Oh, man. But the repressed hostility engendered by neglect has to go somewhere. Frequently it turns itself against authority in general. The worst behaved children are the least loved. In all his life, Churchill was to regard anyone in authority with potential dislike. His hostility also found expression in a general aggressiveness and pugnacity, which used to burst out with startling force, and for whose victims Churchill was often afterwards sorry. Damn, my nose is itching. But above all, it led Churchill to compensate by ambition. If the world is unkind, then I will take it on at its own game and beat it. This ambition appeared in Churchill at an extremely early age and took the form of dreams that he had been chosen by destiny for some great purpose. This fantasy was to pursue him until he was 65. And although coming from a political family, politics was the career in which he would most likely choose to shine. It is interesting that political success depends in part on being accepted, admired, even in a sense loved by a great number of people. But parental neglect not only explains the fury of Churchill's ambition, it also explains the form of its final demise. Storr is perceptive about the genesis of this development. A child who is wanted, loved, played with, cuddled, will incorporate within himself a lively sense of his own value, and will therefore surmount the inevitable setbacks and disappointments of childhood with no more than temporary sorrow, secure in the belief that the world is predominantly a happy place and that he has a favored place in it. A child, on the other hand, who is unwanted, rejected, or disapproved of will gain no such conviction, although such a child may experience periods of both success and happiness. These will neither convince him that he is lovable, nor finally prove to him that life is worthwhile. A whole career may be dedicated to the pursuit of power, the conquest of women, or the gaining of wealth, only in the end to leave the person face to face with despair and a sense of futility, since he has never incorporated with himself a sense of his values as a person, and no amount of external success can ultimately compensate him for this. And that will have to be the end of this video, bruv, because I'm at near 30 minutes, and he likes to shut off after 30 minutes. Maybe I'll continue, maybe I won't. Goodbye, bruv.